Story 1. Whistling in the dark. I can't remember when I first heard the superstition about whistling at night. It was just one of those things I'd always known, like the taste of my mother's cooking or the sound of the church bells every Sunday. In our Assyrian community, certain things were taken for granted. Don't leave your shoes upside down, don't sweep the floor after sunset, and above all, never whistle after dark. My grandfather was the one who used to tell us the stories. His deep voice would carry through the dimly lit room as we sat around him, wide-eyed and eager for a tale. He spoke of spirits, unseen but ever-present, who roamed the night searching for those who broke the old ways. It was a warning, a reminder that some things were better left undisturbed. And of course, we believed him. Why wouldn't we? The stories were part of our lives, woven into the fabric of our community, handed down from one generation to the next. But as I grew older, I began to question those stories. They seemed like relics of a bygone era, superstitions meant to keep children in line. I'd seen the world beyond our little village. I'd been to the city, studied in universities, and worked among people who had never even heard of such things. The world was different now. We had technology, science, and rational explanations for everything. What place did old wives' tales have in this new world? I didn't realize how wrong I was. It started a few months after I returned to my village. My father had passed away, and I came back to help my mother and take care of the family home. It was strange being back, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of my childhood. The old stone house creaked and groaned as it always had, the wind whispered through the narrow streets, and the hills around us loomed like silent guardians. Everything was the same, yet I felt a sense of unease that I couldn't quite explain. One night, after a long day of clearing out my father's old things, I found myself sitting on the front porch, staring out into the darkness. The air was cool, and the sky was clear, with the stars shining brightly above. It was a peaceful night, and I felt a strange urge to whistle, a simple, tuneless whistle, just to break the silence. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was a small act of rebellion, a way to challenge the old fears that had no place in my life anymore. Or maybe it was just a thoughtless impulse, a momentary lapse in judgment. Whatever the reason, I put my lips together and whistled. The sound cut through the night, sharp and clear. It echoed off the stone walls and faded into the distance. For a moment, nothing happened. I felt a faint smile tug at the corners of my mouth, a sense of satisfaction at having defied the old superstition. Then, from somewhere in the dark, I heard an answering whistle. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I stopped, listening intently. The sound had come from the direction of the hills, a soft, low whistle that mimicked my own. A shiver ran down my spine. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe some animal, nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. I stood up, suddenly uneasy. The night seemed darker than before, the shadows longer and deeper. The silence was no longer comforting, it pressed in on me, thick and oppressive. I glanced around, half expecting to see something lurking in the dark, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street and the cold night air. I went inside, locking the door behind me. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was being ridiculous, but the unease lingered. I didn't sleep well that night. My dreams were filled with shadows and whispers, shapes moving just beyond the edge of my vision. The next morning, I brushed it off as an overactive imagination. I had been tired, stressed, and grieving. It was natural to feel a little off. But as the days passed, the sense of unease grew stronger. I started hearing things. Faint whispers in the wind, footsteps in the empty halls, and always, that soft, low whistle in the distance, just on the edge of hearing. It would come and go, sometimes vanishing for days, only to return when I least expected it. I didn't mention it to my mother. She had enough to worry about, and I didn't want to add to her burden. But she noticed the change in me, the way I would jump at the slightest sound or stare off into the distance, lost in thought. She asked me once if everything was all right, and I lied, telling her I was fine, just tired. But I could see the worry in her eyes. She knew something was wrong, even if I wouldn't admit it. One evening, about a week after it started, I went to visit my grandfather's grave. It was something I hadn't done since the funeral, and I felt a strange compulsion to go. The cemetery was just outside the village, a small, quiet place surrounded by trees. The sun was setting as I arrived, casting long shadows across the graves. I found his headstone easily. It was simple, with his name and dates engraved in the stone, along with a small cross. I stood there for a long time, staring at the headstone, lost in thought. The whistle was back that evening, faint but persistent, and it seemed to grow louder as I stood there. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone else in the cemetery, but it was empty. I was alone. As the last light of day faded, I knelt by the grave and whispered a quiet prayer, asking for guidance, for protection, for something I couldn't quite name. The air was still, and for a moment, the whistle stopped. I felt a strange sense of calm, as if my grandfather was there with me, watching over me. But then the calm shattered. The whistle returned, louder than ever, and this time, it was close. Too close. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, but there was no one there, just the trees, the graves, and the encroaching darkness. I started to walk back towards the village, trying to stay calm, but my footsteps quickened. The whistle followed me, echoing through the trees, growing closer and closer. I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The village lights were just ahead, a beacon of safety, but they seemed impossibly far away. Then, just as I reached the edge of the cemetery, the whistle stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I stopped, panting, and looked back. That's when I saw them. They stood among the graves, barely visible in the dim light, figures, shadowy and indistinct, watching me. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unforgiving. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. One of them stepped forward, moving slowly, deliberately. The others remained still, their forms blending into the shadows. As the figure approached, I could see more clearly. It was a man, tall and thin, with dark, hollow eyes and a cruel, twisted smile. He raised a hand to his lips and whistled, the sound low and mocking. My blood ran cold. This wasn't real, it couldn't be real. I closed my eyes, willing the figure to disappear, to be gone when I opened them again. But when I did, he was still there, closer now, his smile wider, more menacing. I don't remember how I got home. The next thing I knew, I was bursting through the front door, gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. My mother rushed to me, her face a mask of concern. She asked what had happened, but I couldn't find the words. How could I explain what I'd seen, what I'd felt? That night, I barely slept. The images of the figures in the cemetery haunted my dreams, their hollow eyes and cruel smiles etched into my mind. The whistle was there too, always there, echoing in the darkness, chasing me wherever I went. The next day, I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of the light, the product of an exhausted mind. But deep down, I knew better. The village felt different now, darker, more oppressive. The people went about their lives as usual, but there was an undercurrent of unease, as if they too felt something was wrong but didn't dare speak of it. I avoided the cemetery after that, but the whistle followed me everywhere I went. It was in the wind, in the rustle of leaves, in the creaking of the old house at night. I heard it in my dreams, always just out of sight, just out of reach. I became paranoid, jumpy, always looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those figures again. It was driving me mad. Finally, one night, after a particularly restless evening, I decided to do something I never thought I would. I went to see an old woman who lived on the outskirts of the village, someone my mother had mentioned in passing, a woman known for her knowledge of the old ways, the traditions and superstitions that our people had carried for centuries. Her house was small, nestled among the trees, far from the prying eyes of the village. The locals called her Kalozina, though no one knew if that was her real name or just a nickname passed down through the years. She was old, impossibly so, with a face like crumpled parchment and eyes that seemed to see far beyond the present moment. I had heard stories about her growing up, how she could speak with the dead, how she could see things others couldn't. But I had never given those stories much thought until now. The path to her home was overgrown, the trees arching overhead like a canopy, blocking out the moonlight. As I walked, I felt the familiar sense of unease creeping over me, but it was different this time. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling that something was watching me from the shadows, something that didn't want me to reach my destination. When I finally arrived, Zena was sitting on her porch, as if she had been expecting me. She didn't say a word as I approached, just watched me with those piercing eyes. I hesitated at the foot of the steps, suddenly unsure if this was the right thing to do. But the memory of those figures in the cemetery, the whistle, the eyes, they drove me forward. She motioned for me to sit, and I did, the wooden chair creaking under my weight. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then, without preamble, she spoke, her voice a raspy whisper that seemed to cut through the silence. "You've seen them, haven't you?" The question sent a shiver down my spine. How could she know? I hadn't told anyone about what I'd seen, not even my mother. I nodded slowly, unable to find my voice. "They've been waiting for you," she continued, her eyes boring into mine. "Ever since you whistled. You called them, and now they're here." Who are they?" I finally managed to ask, my voice trembling. She leaned forward, her bony hands gripping the edge of the table between us. "They are the ones who wander the dark, the ones who are neither living nor dead. They are drawn to those who break the old ways, those who invite them in." I didn't mean to, I began, but she cut me off with a wave of her hand. "It doesn't matter what you meant. What matters is what you did. You whistled, and now they've marked you." I felt my heart drop into my stomach. "What do they want?" She was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the trees surrounding her house. "They want what they always want. They want to take. They want to consume." A cold dread settled over me. Is there anything I can do?" Zena's eyes flicked back to mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something like pity in her gaze. "Perhaps. But it won't be easy." I leaned forward, desperate. "Tell me. I'll do anything." She sighed, the sound weary and ancient. "You must confront them. Go to the place where you first called them. You must face them, and you must not show fear. If you can stand your ground, if you can show them that you are not afraid, they may leave you in peace. But if you falter, if you waver, they will take you, body and soul." The thought of facing those things again filled me with a terror unlike anything I'd ever known, but I knew I had no choice. I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep living in fear. I thanked her, though the words felt hollow, and left her house with the weight of the night pressing down on me. The walk back to the village was a blur, my mind racing with what lay ahead. The closer I got, the more the unease grew, morphing into something darker, something more insidious. It wasn't just the thought of facing those creatures, it was the village itself. The streets, once familiar and comforting, now seemed alien, the houses looming like silent sentinels. The people I passed on the way to my house, neighbors I'd known my entire life, were different somehow. It was small things at first, things that made me question my sanity. A man, Minos, who always nodded at me when we passed, looked right through me as if I weren't there. The baker, Toma, who usually greeted me with a smile, stood behind the counter, staring at nothing, his hands still and his eyes vacant. But the worst was when I ran into Sargis, the village elder. He had always been kind, offering me advice when I was younger, telling stories that rivaled even my grandfather's. But when I saw him that night, he was sitting on his porch, staring at the sky, his mouth moving as if he were speaking, though no sound came out. I stopped, frozen, as I watched him. He turned his head slowly to face me, his eyes blank, as if he were looking at something far beyond me. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised a hand to his lips and whistled, a low, eerie sound that sent chills down my spine. I turned and ran. By the time I reached my house, I was shaking. I slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. The whistle followed me, echoing in my ears, no matter how hard I tried to block it out. It was as if the entire village was in on some terrible secret, something that was just out of reach, just beyond my understanding. I collapsed onto the couch, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was racing, filled with images of those figures, of Sargis's blank eyes, of the whistle that haunted my every step. I didn't know what to do, who to trust, where to turn. The village that had once been my home now felt like a trap, a place where something dark and ancient was waiting for me, just out of sight. As the night wore on, I felt the walls closing in on me. The house, once a place of comfort, now seemed suffocating, the air thick with something I couldn't name. I heard noises, soft whispers, creaking floorboards, the sound of footsteps outside my door. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. Just shadows, just the dark. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke with a start to the sound of knocking. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more insistent. I glanced at the clock, 3:37 a.m. My heart pounded in my chest as I got up and walked to the door. The knocking continued, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo in my head. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Everything in me screamed not to open it, to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening. But something else, something deeper, urged me forward. I took a deep breath and opened the door. There was nothing there. Just the empty street, the dark night, and the faint whistle in the distance. But then I looked down. On the doorstep, scratched into the wood with what looked like fingernails, were 3 words. "You are next." I stumbled back, slamming the door shut. My mind was reeling, my thoughts a chaotic mess. They were here, they were coming for me, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. The whistle grew louder, filling the house, echoing in every room, every corner. I knew then that the village wasn't just different, it was tainted, cursed. The people I had known my entire life, the people I had trusted, were part of something dark, something ancient, something I couldn't understand. And now, they were all watching me, waiting for the moment I would fall, the moment I would give in. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air thick and suffocating. I could hear them now, the figures from the cemetery, moving through the house, whispering in the dark. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking. They were here, they were everywhere, and there was no escape. I was trapped. As the whistle filled the air, as the shadows closed in, I realized the terrible truth. I had brought this on myself. I had broken the old ways, and now they were here to collect. There was no running, no hiding, no escaping. They would come for me, and when they did, they would take everything. I sank to the floor, the knife from the couch still in my hand. The whistle grew louder, filling my head, drowning out all other sound. The shadows moved closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. I could see them now, the figures from the cemetery, their hollow eyes and cruel smiles, reaching for me. I had only one thought as the darkness closed in: I should never have whistled. And then, the door opened behind me, and the cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of decay. I turned, and there they were, standing in the doorway, their eyes fixed on me, their smiles wide and terrible. They were here, and they weren't leaving until they had what they came for. The last thing I heard was the whistle, low and mocking, as they stepped inside and the door swung shut behind them. Story 2. I was a 5-React gum test subject. Most people probably remember those 5-React gum commercials that came out in the mid-2000s. They somehow made chewing gum look like the coolest thing in the world. It was a cinematic experience that put other commercials at the time to shame. I remember back a few months before the commercials first came out, the Wrigley Company was doing a casting call for the actors. I figured it would be an easy gig since it was just a simple gum commercial. How hard could it be? Being a broke college student, opportunities like this were way too good to pass up on. The casting call went way differently from anything I expected. Me and a group of actors stood outside a local mall where we had to wait for business execs from Wrigley to pick us up. Shortly after we all arrived, a large black van pulled up and a guy in shades welcomed us inside. I found the whole thing kinda sketchy, but I had bills to pay, so I was willing to put up with almost anything at that point. The 6 of us all got in and chatted with each other to pass the time until we got to our destination. It turned out that all of us came from a similar background. We were all just college students trying to scrape together whatever money we could before inevitably falling into debt. It was reassuring yet incredibly unnerving that poverty was such an ingrained part of the college experience. Maybe I should have gotten a major in education, because it was clear that the College Board had perfected the art of legal racketeering. It wasn't until about 40 minutes into the drive did I notice that the trip felt oddly long. I lived in a major Californian city at the time, so there were commercial studios literally everywhere. The van eventually parked in front of a high-rise building in a quiet part of town. We exited the vehicle to step inside and were immediately floored by a burst of cold air. It was a much-needed relief from the summer heat. The men in suits led us to a small room where we were given a change of clothes. It was a bunch of grungy-looking tank tops and jackets that looked like they came from a sci-fi movie. It was definitely an odd choice for a gum commercial, but I wasn't complaining. We were then handed a stick of blue gum and told that it was mint-flavored. I was surprised when they didn't hand us a script. Apparently, they just wanted to film our natural reaction to the gum. Like I said earlier, it was going to be an easy paycheck. I took a bite of the gum, and as I began chewing, my senses went absolutely wild. My surroundings were replaced by an Arctic tundra being buffeted by intense snowfall. The freezing winds chilled my entire body over to the point that my teeth began to chatter. The other participants and I were all freaking the hell out. What kind of drugs did they lace this gum with? We all shared the same hallucination and could even touch the snow as if it were real. The snow even loudly crunched as we walked around. I've experimented with drugs here and there, but I've never experienced a high that felt so lucid. Getting high usually feels like stepping into a dream, where everything is ethereal and nothing has any weight to it. The snowfall began picking up at an extreme rate. We were soon getting buried by an endless blizzard that spawned out of nowhere. We all ran around like headless chickens until the trenches of snow made it impossible to move. I felt my blood turn to ice and my heart beating against my chest like it was trying to break free. Was I about to die? We jolted back to reality, sweat profusely racing down our heads. The Wrigley executives smiled widely at us while writing down notes on their clipboards. They told us that the Wrigley Company was developing a brand of gum completely unlike anything else. The gum was made with special chemicals that could induce realistic hallucinations in the brain. The experience only lasted for a few minutes, but the high I got from it had me hooked. I needed more of that rush. Each stick of gum they handed us was a new sublime experience. I was sent to tropical getaways, rainforests, the middle of the ocean, and just about anywhere in nature. The commercials everyone else is familiar with are just a mock-up of the real experience. Nothing could ever compare to the real thing. My mind was completely taken over by the need for more stimulation. Nothing else in the world mattered to me anymore. I needed another quick fix. I was so elated when they handed us a new mystery flavor. My mind raced at the idea of getting to experience another burst of euphoria. I excitedly bit into it and was transported to yet another world. This world was different, however. I fell into an endless white void, my shrill screams being the only source of sound. We all looked at each other in shock as our bodies fluttered through the air. My body plummeted for what felt like eons until we crash-landed in the middle of the ocean. I tried to rise to the surface, but that water engulfed me whole and submerged me deeper. I watched a woman next to me drown before she was dragged to the bottom of the sea by a cluster of tentacles. The rest of us managed to swim to the surface, but it hardly did any good. A bolt of lightning struck down on the water and zapped us to a crisp. The funny thing is that it wasn't just the pain I felt. Fear, excitement, and even pleasure coursed through me. My mind was shifting through every emotion I ever experienced. The emotional whiplash of it made me feel like my mind was being ripped apart. The water then turned to ice, encasing me in an Arctic coffin. Scents of peppermint and citrus tickled my nose while the rest of my senses faded into nothing. I woke up in a hospital 3 days later. My doctor told me some guy in a suit dropped me off here and left without saying a word. I looked over at my drawer and saw an envelope that was stuffed with money, more than enough to cover my college costs. Attached to it was a note that made it explicitly clear not to reveal what happened that day or there would be dire consequences. That day still plays in my head all these years later. It's just crazy to believe that I almost lost my life over some gum. I tried getting in touch with my co-stars from the commercial, but they went completely off the grid. Their social media accounts were left vacant, with the only activity being their friends and family asking them on their wall where they went. I imagine they had an even worse experience with the mystery flavor than I did. I wonder if they're even still alive. Even when I write everything down in this diary, I can still hardly believe what happened to me. My life has never been the same since then. I've tried in vain for several years to chase after that high. No amount of narcotics could ever compare to how that experiment made me feel. I've been in and out of the hospital for overdosing more times than I can count, but it doesn't matter. I'm willing to try anything to recapture that feeling. My bank account is currently on its last legs and most of my friends won't talk to me. It's almost funny, really. Who would have guessed that a simple pack of gum could have led to such a downward spiral? Story 3. My roommate had this dark spot in his eye. It was my first year in college, and my heart raced with excitement when I received my acceptance letter. The first thing I did was search for a place to stay, knowing the commute from home to the university was far too long. After a few days of searching, I found a student-friendly dorm just a few minutes walk from campus. It seemed perfect. On my first day moving into the dorm, I met my roommate, Dave. He was a kind-hearted, tall, and impeccably neat guy who graciously introduced me to the other students in the dorm. We shared a bunk bed, me on the top and him on the bottom. Everything seemed fine and normal, but I couldn't help but notice a peculiar dark spot in his eye. One day, he caught me staring and explained that he had been born with it. I didn't want to pry further, so I let it go. Dave was an outgoing type of person. We sometimes walked to campus together. Despite being a first-year student like me, he seemed to know more about the campus than most. Although our personalities were polar opposites, him extroverted and me more introverted, we hit it off well. He was fun to hang out with. One night, after a particularly exhausting lecture, I returned to the dorm to take a shower and unwind. After cooling off, I went straight to bed. Dave was already there, possibly asleep, but he kept murmuring words too softly for me to understand. I figured he might be from a province and speaking a dialect I didn't know. His eyes were moving beneath his eyelids, and I assumed he was sleep-talking or dreaming, which I thought was a good sign he was having a restful night. I climbed up to my bunk and tried to shut my exhausted eyes, feeling the heaviness of sleep overtaking me. As I was drifting off, the bunk bed started to move slightly, then shook a bit more. I figured Dave was just shifting below, so I didn't give it much thought and tried to sleep. Hours later, I was jolted awake by a sudden, violent shake of the bed. In the dim light, I peered over the edge and saw Dave in the same position he had been in when I first climbed up. This was odd, considering how much he had been moving around lately. Frustrated, I whispered, "Dave, stop moving, I'm trying to sleep." Exhaustion weighed heavily on me, and all I wanted was to rest. In the morning, Dave seemed more energetic than usual, and I noticed the dark spot in his eye was gone. Curious, I asked, "Is it me, or is the dark spot gone from your eye, Dave?" He shrugged and explained that sometimes the dark spot mysteriously vanished. He had consulted doctors and specialists, who dismissed it as a minor mole in the eye. I found his explanation somewhat convincing, though the sudden disappearance of such a prominent feature seemed peculiar. I nodded and continued with my morning routine, pushing the oddity to the back of my mind. Weeks passed, and the dark spot reappeared, this time in Dave's other eye. My curiosity gnawed me, but I kept my questions to myself, not wanting to seem nosy. Yet, the shifting dark spot bothered me like a forgotten song lyric, just out of reach but incessantly nagging. More days passed, and I pulled myself together, trying to ignore the unsettling eye condition Dave had. We hung out a few times, and he really was just a funny, kind, and hardworking student. Everything seemed to be sailing smoothly in our college life. Then another night came. After a long exam day, I returned to the dorm exhausted. Dave was already asleep, as usual, his murmurs filling the room again. This time, his words were louder, though still incomprehensible. As I listened, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It sounded like he was speaking in a language I had never heard before, in a low growling noise. I climbed up to my bunk, but sleep eluded me. The bed shook slightly again, just as it had before. My mind was too exhausted from the exam to react, but the uneasy feeling lingered, making it hard to fully relax. Suddenly, the room grew colder. I pulled my blanket tighter around me, shivering. The temperature drop was sharp and unnatural. I glanced at Dave. He seemed unaffected, still murmuring in his sleep. Restless, I couldn't shake the conviction that something was wrong with Dave. Unable to bear the mystery any longer, I decided to stay awake and observe. As Dave slept, his murmuring grew louder and more intense. His words, still foreign, had a sinister undertone. Then his body started to twitch and convulse, the bed shaking violently. I leaned over the edge of my bunk, heart pounding. Dave's eyes flew open, glowing faintly in the dark. The dark spot in his eye seemed to pulse, as if alive. A chill ran down my spine. I whispered, "Dave?" He didn't respond, but the murmuring stopped abruptly. He opened his eyes, and I saw that they were entirely black, the darkness enveloping his entire eyes. Maybe the angle and the shadow of the dark caused it, but then he gave me a cold look, then closed them again. The room fell into an eerie silence. I lay back down, trembling, unable to shake the feeling. The next morning, Dave acted as if nothing had happened, his usual energetic self. But I couldn't ignore what I had seen. It was terrifying. I had never in my life seen a sleep talker so intense. It felt like Dave was a completely different person that night. Now, I'm genuinely concerned about Dave. He seems like a good guy, but when he sleeps, he becomes a completely different guy. I confronted him about the strange things he does in his sleep, but he just denied it. I keep wondering, what's wrong with him? Is he not aware that he growls and speaks in a different language while he sleeps? If I were doing something odd in my sleep, I'd want to know. Maybe it's just me, but I'm worried about him. Perhaps I was wrong to pry, but I can't sleep at night because of it. I'm scared of what he does when he sleeps, and I don't know how to react. I tried to ignore it, but it kept happening. Dave seems completely unaware. Is it epilepsy? Or maybe somnambulism? I can't help but wonder. Then that night occurred again. As usual, he was already asleep when I got to the dorm. I showered and tried to sleep. In the middle of the night, the temperature dropped sharply. It felt icy cold. I tried to tuck myself under the blanket, then I saw Dave standing, facing the door. He was completely still. I was freaked out. I called, "Dave, you okay?" He didn't respond. I called again, "You okay, buddy?" He turned to look at me, his eyes closed. I was terrified. Dude freaks me out in the middle of the night. I just want to sleep, but Dave's behavior is unusual. This is scary, too scary. I can't handle this kind of pressure, so I jumped out of bed, wanting to leave the room. Dave was still standing, blocking the door, staring at me with his eyes closed. I knew he was looking. I approached him and reached for the doorknob. He then started to talk. "Hello, Keith." "Yes, that's my name." I was shocked. Is he really asleep or sleepwalking? What is this horror show? Is he messing with me? I twisted the knob and jolted to leave the room, but Dave grabbed my shoulder. He was strong, pinning me to the wall while still holding my shoulder. I shouted. I couldn't handle the overwhelming fear. I was absolutely terrified. Dave woke up suddenly, tears streaming down his face. He let go of me and whispered, he was controlling me. What? Who's controlling you? I asked, my voice trembling with concern. My brother, he replied in a chilling, sinister voice. Then, he grinned, a smile stretching from ear to ear, his eyes turning completely black like coal and brimstone. I jumped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran, my legs moving faster than they ever had. I bolted down the stairs, waking up other students. They asked what was happening, but I couldn't speak. Fear had taken hold of me, rendering me mute. I was terrified of my roommate. The next morning, I didn't go to school. I waited for Dave to leave first, then I packed my things and left. That was the last time I saw him. I transferred to a new school and started my studies in Manila instead.